Next, I'm going to turn to Amy Fong. Amy is a statistician at the Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy, where we've had the opportunity at Wheelhouse to support some really innovative work over there over the past decade to increase the employment of people with disabilities. Amy recently came to DOL from the Department of Transportation through the Presidential Management Fellowship Program, and she was so impressive that they just offered her a permanent job. It's great working with her because she really brings a fresh perspective at the intersection of people and place and transportation to what is otherwise a pretty well-established team. So Amy, we're really glad that you're here today, and I look forward to hearing as you look back over the past year, what did you face and what did you learn?
Thanks. And yeah, so the story that I wanted to share today reaches back a little bit before the pandemic started. So I'll start by saying I'm telling my story today from the traditional territory of the Nacotchtank, Anacostan, and Piscataway peoples, which today we know as Washington, D.C. So when I finished grad school in 2019, I moved to DC from Texas with 3 suitcases to work at the Federal Transit Administration, a sub-agency of the Department of Transportation. I was eager to get to work, and I knew that I didn't know exactly what I'd be doing when I got there, but I just knew that any way I could contribute to the mission of improving public transportation in America's communities would be valuable and rewarding. And it just so happened that when I was coming in, the woman who was managing the tribal transit program, which is exactly what it sounds like, it funds transit services provided by federally recognized tribes. She was on her way out and she had no replacement. So it was only by circumstance that I was given the opportunity to manage this program. And the first thing I did, because I had never really thought about tribal transportation before, was I started introducing myself to people at the department already who had been working with tribes for years to get their advice and their perspectives. And now, even though there are many people in federal government who work with tribes, work in tribal affairs, and work on tribal funding programs, at the Department of Transportation, tribal transportation is a pretty small subset of what the department does. So there weren't that many people to find in the first place. But for each of them, I asked, I'm new, you should know and assume that I don't know what I'm doing. And I want you to tell me what you think is essential for me to do well in this role. And what I overwhelmingly heard was 1, learn the history, 2, understand tribal sovereignty, and 3, know and respect that every single tribe in this country is unique in its culture, history, government structure, and relationship with the US government. So right off the bat, I faced a challenge because 1, I didn't know any of the history, but I knew enough to know that it was filled with injustice and oppression. 2, I had no idea what tribal sovereignty was. And 3, to be honest, I realized that I only held stereotypes about what it's like to be Native American in this country, something about life on reservations. And in fact, I personally believed that my understanding was that Native Americans were a monolithic population group that mostly lived on reservations. And that ignorance that I had never been forced to examine before was hard for me to admit to myself as someone who is Chinese American and have experienced stereotypes about myself too. So right off the bat, my challenge was that I had to change. So I started trying to learn, and I couldn't do the history justice by trying to summarize it all now, but we all have to acknowledge that the history of the federal government with tribes is one of broken treaties, broken promises, genocide, cultural erasure, and assimilation. And that really troubled me because when you look at the history books, you see these vilifying accounts of military generals, presidents, Supreme Court justices, and so on, who made decisions that today we judge as wrong. But the truth is, a lot of public servants, people like me now, were also complicit in carrying out those policies. And the bright side is, since about the 1970s, that relationship has changed and the US has begun to affirm the sovereignty of tribal nations or their right to self-governance. But the truth is that the broken trust still exists. I've heard that myself from tribal leaders directly. And that's really intimidating. So you can imagine, as a public servant who is just beginning to grasp this fraught history and this fraught present, I was really afraid of one day looking back and realizing that I would end up doing something or had done something in my work with tribes that would also place me on the wrong side of history. And what I realized was that I couldn't be the only one having these fears and thoughts. So like I said, there are a few, but not many people at DOT who work closely with tribes. And we were all spread out, not in the same offices or agencies. But here's what I did. I knew that every regional office had a tribal liaison, someone dedicated to manage tribal grants and relationships in their region. And usually it was only a subset of their total workload. And often they didn't communicate with one another or coordinate. And I realized that just like for me in headquarters, where I was one of only a few people working on tribal issues, they too were out in our regional offices, probably the only person in that office who worked with tribes as well. So what I wanted to do was simple. I just wanted to connect with and support other people like me in that position of trying to do the right thing and working with tribes. And I wanted to show them that they had an ally and an accomplice in the headquarters office and in other offices around the country. And my hope was that by doing so, each of us would find the courage and the resilience to advocate for the tribes that we worked with in our offices, even if sometimes we found ourselves being the only ones in the room doing so. So I started having monthly calls with everyone at FTA that worked with tribes, kind of setting up a community of practice. And honestly, these calls were really awkward at first because I was asking people who didn't really normally talk to each other to start talking to each other. And I did these awkward calls for a year before something changed. After a year, I finally started noticing that people would start saying things like, I have this sticky situation with one of the tribes I work with. I know some of our normal policies and requirements don't apply in the same way because tribes have a unique status in this country. I'm not sure what to do. Has anybody faced something similar? And other people would start to jump in and say, yeah, I have. And when I faced that similar situation, I also didn't know how to handle it in the right way. And we would share our experiences and advice. And also very interestingly, the truth is sometimes people would say something that was rooted in a stereotype, and then someone else would have the courage to say something about that and correct that. And as a group, we could find that we could embrace that discomfort. And instead of vilifying anybody, we would appreciate that it was an opportunity to bust a myth and an opportunity for change. And so in doing that, what did I learn? I learned that in my colleagues, my federal employee colleagues, when given a space to be vulnerable and to learn from one another, they would take that opportunity and rise to the challenge. And I learned that, it's Public Service Recognition Week. I learned that I worked with incredibly humble, thoughtful, and reflective public servants, and that each of us have that capacity to be vulnerable with one another, especially when someone has the courage to be the first one to admit that they don't know something. And we had some tangible successes too. I don't have time to go through all of the things I'm proud of my coworkers for doing in that time, but I got a lot of coworkers to sign up for tribal consultation trainings, and one regional office even started looking into paying for that training for every single person in their office. I got a colleague from our policy office who was holding a big roundtable that moved virtual because of the pandemic. That was supposed to feature CEOs from transit agencies around the country. She allowed me to invite a tribal leader to present alongside CEOs from San Francisco and New York and so on. And she got to represent rural and tribal transportation. And that was just representation. Here's something interesting. When I was leaving FTA a few months ago, my former supervisor told me that she really wanted to hire someone with a tribal or Native American background into my role next. And let me just say that would be a fantastic symbol of making room at a table for a voice that has been underrepresented for too long. And so what am I going to take into the future? Well, when I think about the experience of managing the tribal transit program, what I'm most proud of about that time was not any specific thing that I or my colleagues did, but the ongoing practice that we each made out of being vulnerable enough to admit that when it came to working with tribes, we didn't always know what the right or moral thing to do was. And to me, that was huge because I came into that job feeling this pressure to be the expert on something. And I felt paralyzed by the fact that in working with tribes, I was trying to do work for a set of communities and peoples that I didn't share a lived experience with or could identify with or empathize directly with. All I knew was I didn't want to carry forward that that paternalistic or savior type relationship that is all over the history of the US government with tribes. And so here's my takeaway, and I think this is for everyone, but I think it's especially relevant for my colleagues in federal government as our government shifts hard towards acknowledging and addressing the racial and social injustices that are woven into our history, which is to don't be afraid to be vulnerable at work. It's okay to admit when you don't know something, and you'll probably be relieved to find that there are other people who are wondering some of the same things as you. And if you take that leap, you'll probably be rewarded with the opportunity to learn and to grow and to change. Thank you.
Amy, thank you so much. We are so excited to have you as a public servant and just so thankful that you chose this career. You know, we've been talking for a long time about this silver tsunami of retiring folks in government, and we very rarely hear from voices of new leaders, and we're just so excited that you joined, and I can't wait to see all the amazing things that you do at Department of Labor. So thank you for sharing your story and for participating today.